Remember these two guys from The Princess Bride where the little villain kept using the word inconceivable and the Spanish swordman says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." Well, I'm here to say something similar about ontological shock. And that might be shocking to you, but if you've learned about ontological shock from John Mack or the documentaries he's been featured in, or from an abductee who has been influenced by Dr. John Mack, then it may not mean what you think it means. So this is a presentation of DSETI, the dream study of extraterrestrial intelligence. This is called Ontological Shock, several shocking definitions. So this inquiry is all about the term ontological shock. Is it a manipulative and cultish term? That is my inquiry here and now today, and I'm going to answer those questions through a critical literature review. I'm applying the methods of my discipline as a scholar and a researcher to this topic, and I'm just looking at the literature right now. I'm not even going to get to a spot where I can make a conclusion, but I can make an informed inquiry based upon literature, and that's what I'm going to do here and now today. So I need to frame the inquiry. I'm going to talk about why I'm doing this and contextualize it and hopefully explain myself to minimize the offense I cause to the experiencer community while maximizing the impact of my literature reviews, right? I'm going to look at contemporary use of ontological shock, the cultish use of language, standard definitions of the language, ontological shock, cognitive dissonance. I'm going to talk about John Mack's 1994 definition. I'm going to talk about Paul Tillich's 1951 definition of ontological shock. I'm going to offer a hypothesis, and I am then going to reframe the phrase ontological shock. So let's get into the framing of this inquiry. I do believe in ET and NHI encounters. The testimony of lived experience is sacred. This is very, very important. The use of testimony, however, to support public policy and political activism is subject to forceful criticism. You can tell me all you want about your extraordinary, paranormal, abduction, whatever experiences, and I'll accept them and treat them as sacred. But as soon as you start using those testimonies to support a political agenda about how I believe my world should be and how I believe my government is behaving and what I believe they are hiding or whatever, as soon as you start to say, you should not trust the government, you should enact a political agenda because of this testimony, I will then question that testimony. And whether or not we like it, abduction testimony has been used to support the contemporary disclosure narrative. And I'll talk about why and how coming up shortly. But that's the reason why I say abduction testimony is exposed and vulnerable to forceful criticism over and above any other form of testimony. That's why I'm doing this. And in part, I'm doing this inquiry because I believe that inquiring into abduction testimony right now from both a credulous and a skeptical perspective will elevate abduction testimony to be solid over and above its enmeshment with the disclosure narrative, let's say. So abduction testimonies do appear to support political UFO activism like the disclosure movement. The contemporary dialogue regarding crash retrievals reframes and obscures abduction epistemologies, but there is a clear and direct relationship that is evident upon literature review. John Mack is really connected with Danny Sheehan and Blumenthal. Those are connected with the UFO whistleblower and the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023. Hopkins is connected with Keene, who is, like Blumenthal, connected with David Grush, with the 2017 New York Times article. And Bigelow actually is involved with the 2017 New York Times article in the UFO research, as well as the early 1990s abduction research. So there's a surprising overlap between all of the alien abduction players of the early 90s and the contemporary crash retrieval narratives of the disclosure movement. This comes from my understanding that if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it is likely a duck, right? If it flies like a satellite and flashes like a satellite, it is likely a satellite, even though people have said it's not a satellite And even though credentialed people say it's not a satellite, unless they're credentialed in space surveillance or satellites, I'm not going to believe them, right? If it looks like a false memory and was retrieved from a hypnotic session by a questionable hypnotist and has been used to support an abduction book, best-selling book, and is now being used to support a political agenda, I say it is likely a false memory being exploited for particular reasons rather than a veridical memory, right? Now, I say that screen memories and imaginations and experience and lived experience is all sacred. But I really need to just say, right, if you're bringing something that looks like a false memory to the table as evidence for a political agenda, and I'm sorry, not all abductees are, but some truly are actually supporting the disclosure movement political agenda, then I need to question, is this a false memory? Is this a dream? Or is this truly veridical waking phase testimony? Finally, if it feels like a cult and uses language like a cult and enacts a cult-like belief system around a charismatic leader, then it is likely a cult. So I am not saying that about John Mack right now, but I am asking those questions right now. And if I cannot ask those questions without being ostracized from a community, then it looks like a cult to me. And I'm going to provide literary evidence for why it likely, in my books, seems cult-like. Now, that's okay, because there's a whole spectrum within culture between cult-like, cult, and just culture. And the difference is exploitation and coercion. And I say that the political agenda of the disclosure movement is exploiting and coercing abductees and experiencers to offer their testimony in a political agenda that is not essential to abductee or experiencer testimony. Looks like exploitation to me. So I need to provide some context, right? I have been on a triggering inquiry for myself and some members of my audience, asking questions like these. Is disclosure a cult? Is it reasonable to be concerned about the UFO abduction syndrome? I say those are reasonable questions given the literature, but no one actually has pointed to any literature or provided an argument based in literature against or responding to my questions. I've received insults. I've received other sorts of communications. I've been kicked out of a support group, but no one's actually addressed any of my questions. Right? Finally, don't most of these things look like dreams? I think that's a reasonable question. Some people took action to get me kicked out of an experiencer support group without providing me direct feedback. I still don't have direct feedback about why my inquiry was triggering, what even people are talking about. I have said several triggering things, and I don't know which of those actually caused the issue. It was primarily a disclosure-oriented, abductee-informed support group. It is assumed, the cause was assumed to be the alien abduction BS believer syndrome video. That was a particular bit of satire calibrated to address the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. No one has actually told me why, and I still don't know. I'm providing this kind of inquiry to defend my position a little bit, as well as to point to why I'm actually willing to offend the community and be kicked out of it in order to ask these questions. It's not the first abduction group to kick me out of because of questions, but it may actually be the last abduction group. So abduction is not like the other contact modalities because it is used to enact a political agenda. Experiencer testimony is sacred. Why and how are great questions. Why is it sacred? How is it sacred? I say it's sacred because it is a dream or dreamlike experience, and we need to honor it using ethics, an ethics guideline. And I use the ethics of Dreamwork as put forward by the International Association of the Study of Dreams. Abductee testimony has been consistently used to fuel political activism, unlike ghost, angel, or fae stories. right? If we only have censored data of anomalies to prove that UFOs are real, then abduction testimonies have been used to establish the expectation that aliens are real too. If abduction testimony is true, then there are bodies and craft. If there are bodies and craft, then we should know about it. If we don't know about it, then someone's hiding it. If someone's hiding it, then it must be the government. Therefore, if we believe abductees, then we must believe the government is hiding bodies, craft, and we must take political action. I don't believe this. I don't believe that we need to enact a political drama in order to support experiencers. Prove me otherwise. I am willing to offend the experiencer community and be rejected by abductees because I believe they will benefit from my literature review-based inquiry. This is hard for me too. I'm not speaking against your testimony and beliefs. I'm speaking against their inappropriate use in the wrong domain of epistemology to enact a political drama. For not your benefit, not my benefit, somebody else's. I'm putting together a literature argument against clearly defined pseudoscience. I'm not skeptical of your testimony. If I don't put forward these arguments to the community, and if the community does not respond to my arguments, then aggressive and lampooning skeptics may put forward these arguments. And I say that they're very, very close to, which is one of the reasons that has given me courage and conviction, actually, to speak up within these communities, is because I am looking outside as well as inside. And I say that there is a lot of anger, a lot of confusion from people who do not have experiences of the phenomena and can relate to you. I'm much nicer than those aggressive skeptics. I believe your testimony, although I question most, including my own interpretations. If you don't like my statements or my literature or my arguments or how I'm delivering them, you can actually just communicate with me. I've opened the door pretty wide. So you can offer new literature, you can critique my arguments, and you can just say how I'm impacting you. That would be totally fine. You can send me an email. We can set up time to talk. I do Zoom calls. My consultations are absolutely free and no obligation. Sometimes I do ask for donations after the fact, and that's generally expected after Dreamwork sessions, but not my rather lengthy consultations. So just email me, daniel@dseti.org, if there's any issue you have with me directly instead of tattling. So I would appreciate that. So how does cognitive dissonance become ontological shock to make abduction become disclosure, right? So here's a process I'm going to walk through, and this is essential to my argument, right? So first step is that the experiencer/abductee is seeking meaning from inexplicable or anomalous events, typically our dreams or dreamlike experiences. The dissonance is, my experience is a dream, but it feels real. Right? You wake up from in the middle of the night, you feel paralyzed, there's little beings in your room, something happens, you are put back in a place that you're not expecting, and it seems dreamlike, but it also seems very real. How is that possible? Well, here's a possible reduction. Or the resolution, and I'm shortcutting it here. Experiences can be both dreams and real. That's it, right? This is a polyphasic perspective. The perspective that it either is a dream or real is a monophasic bias, and we'll talk about that later in the literature. Step 2 is the experiencer doesn't experience that resolution. They keep looking, and they explore UFO abduction, but not really other explanations. So a cognitive reduction occurs as an interlocutor validates the ET hypothesis. By the way, cognitive dissonance is really about, it's the opposite of cognitive dissonance, right? Dissonance is, how is it possible you're diseased at what's happening in your cognitive system? And the reduction involves a reduction of anxiety around those things because of addition to that cognitive system or movement around those things. So an interlocutor, meaning a hypnotist, a podcaster, a support group, comes into your life and says, oh yeah, the ET hypothesis, yeah, that's probably it, me too. And so there's a reduction of the experience because other people are There's a reduction of the dissonance because other people are validating it. The experience is real, but not a dream. That's really where the reduction first comes in when we bring in the abduction hypothesis. It's real, but not a dream. Then a new wave of dissonance is relabeled as ontological shock. This is central to my argument or inquiry here. So I go, if my dreamlike experience is real, then I must accept psychic, sexually traumatizing space aliens into my worldview. Right? This is ontological shock in a nutshell, right? If you believe in abduction testimonies, then you have to believe psychic space aliens can travel across the galaxy and they kidnap bodies, and they perform fantastic sexual traumas on them for unknown purposes, and they put the bodies back, but with mind wipes. And there's no evidence for it, except there is sometimes. So that's sort of a dissonance. You go, like, what is really going on there? I'm very much in a cognitive dissonance now. But it is, right, so I say the dissonance is this. The sexually traumatizing psychic space aliens don't make sense. They just don't make sense. But the possibility is actually entertained because of a variety of reasons, including support groups, hypnotists, podcasters, book authors, John Mack, Oprah entertaining the possibility. It's fascinating. The stories are amazing. Everyone kind of has dream experiences anyways, so they're kind of relating anyways. But so there's a new wave of dissonance. And then the reduction to that dissonance actually is that it is relabeled as ontological shock. And this is the movement that I'm critiquing here. The relabeling of dissonance, cognitive dissonance as ontological shock. You go, I don't feel at ease with the notion that psychic space aliens are visiting Earth in this way. And then all the experts go, oh, no. Everyone experiences that. That's ontological shock. That means your worldview is expanding. And it really does, but in a twisted way. So how does abduction become disclosure? Well, if aliens steal my bodies to do things in UFO craft, then there must be bodies to do the things, and there must be UFO craft to do it in. The dissonance is there is no proof for alien bodies or UFO craft. By the way, if you think otherwise, just send me a link to evidence. But many people say there is. I'd love if many of those people would send me specific evidence, not say, hey, it's out there. We can look for it. We can get to it. But actually just have a document out there that says all the evidence for UFO craft and alien bodies, and put some links there and send it around, right? If it's that important to you to have people believe in these things, you can literally just have a document. And if it's really that available out there in the world, just have a list. So the reduction to all of that dissonance is the government is capturing and hiding all of the evidence. That's where we're at now. I am raising my concerns because experiencer abductee testimonies may be being exploited for an ungrounded political agenda. Whose political agenda is it? I'm not sure. It looks like Chris Mellon. It looks like other people, but I'm not sure. But it looks like abductee and experiencer testimonies are being used for that political agenda. Some elements of the public are getting angry at the disclosure movement because A, large and extraordinary claims are made. B, there is no evidence. C, a select few of people seem to be profiting. And D, it obscures authentic inquiry. So... Whether or not we like it, abductee testimony has political relevance. Therefore, it is vulnerable and exposed to rightful criticism and questioning from people who are rightly angry and skeptical. I am not those people, but I pay attention to many perspectives, and I am actively concerned about disclosure and its community. I'm not concerned about whether or not the political agenda of disclosure is achieved in 2023, 2024, whatever, or 2027. I don't care. I actually care if the experiencers who are exploring and offering their testimonies are respected in a way that is politically agnostic, that doesn't rely upon the government to take action in order to validate their lived experience. What if ETNHI contact is actually dreamlike and real? It seems like the only things skeptics and credulous researchers agree on. What if there are no bodies and craft, only stories? Are the stories without bodies and craft real? I say yes. How can we honor the reality of our stories without causing ontological shock, i.e., assuming that craft and bodies demonstrate reality, therefore the government is hiding them? The disclosure movement, what if the disclosure movement is based upon false assumptions and epistemologies? What if? Who will advocate for experiencer testimonies? Can we be disclosure agnostic while supporting experiencers? All right, so now we're going to ground this starting in literature, talking about ontological shock. There's going to be a lot of reading in this experience, so please use video speed controller to increase the speed of my reading if you want, slow it down. Use the timestamps in the chapter selectors below to really get to where you want. But I would recommend actually going through this literature with me. If you use the term ontological shock in your life, in your business, in your political agendas, you should just be familiar with the literature around these things. So this is from Dr. Richard Hall, who is a scientist associated with the Fund for UFO Research in the early 90s, and he's writing about a conference that the Prince of Liechtenstein helped fund, and he's giving a report about that conference. So he says, this is an example of really early ontological shock, but it doesn't include the word. But I wanted to label this or show this because it's very, very apt. So he writes, I personally found the content of the conference very mind-expanding and stimulating. That's an abduction study conference. But also rather startling and disturbing in many ways. Up until recently, I have been able to view the subject in a very detached and objective manner. Now that the apparent literal reality of it is sinking in, due to Bud's important case with outside witnesses, we'll talk about that later, actually, and I believe that maybe the book witnessed. The global patterns and the credibility of some of my clients, I may have some trouble in the future. Like the victims, as I consider them to be. By the way, that was Bud Hopkins, who taught John Mack how to do hypnosis. Like the victims, as I consider them to be, my conception of reality and my worldview are being shaken, and I have to adjust in some way. Fortunately for me, I have had a lot of preparation, and the adjustment will be easier for me than most people. Still, I got a strong dose of reality, which has not been easy to digest. Another disturbing thing is that a New Age religion of sorts evidently is emerging based on a benign interpretation of the aliens. I agree with Bud that different people manage to cope in different ways, but self-delusion is not a healthy way to cope in the long run, and we certainly don't need New Age notions attached to this already difficult and confusing subject. Richard Hall, 1992, to Hans Adam Liechtenstein. This was held in the John E. Mack archives, in the Archives of the Impossible at Rice University. Thank you to the John E. Mack Institute archivist/consultant for providing this letter. Okay, so now we're in the contemporary definition of ontological shock, and I'm going to play you a clip from a podcast by Kelly Chase, who is putting forward this disclosure field guide in response to David Grush's 2023 claims that there are UFOs, bodies, all of the stuff that the UFO abductees have been waiting for the government to disclose in order to validate their testimonies of dreamlike encounters with space aliens. So I will put the text up there that I got from the transcription and simply just play it. Let me see.
To be the finishing move on UFO secrecy, then what the community is going through right now in processing this information is but a shadow of what we'll be seeing throughout our society in the coming months and years. It all comes back to something that I've been noticing in myself over the last few days as more of David Grush's extraordinary claims come to light. And it's something that I really didn't expect to see: ontological shock. If you're not familiar, ontological shock is a term used to describe a profound and disorienting psychological state that occurs when one's understanding of reality is dramatically altered, usually due to an encounter or a revelation that conflicts with previously held beliefs about the nature of existence. So it was incredibly surprising to me to recognize that that was what I was experiencing. After all, I walked away from my career to do this work full time. On a typical day, I'm thinking about UFOs and non human intelligence from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed. And as a result, the things that Grush said were only surprising to me because it was surprising to hear a high level intelligence official say them in such a public and intentional way. But not because anything that he said was entirely new or unexpected. So, where was this coming from? In talking with some wise friends, what I've come to recognize is that the process of dismantling the illusion of our consensus reality is a long one. And when we're exposed to a big enough shock to our ontological system, we inevitably end up processing these things in stages. And the progress in this area is rarely linear. It's more like a spiral where moving forward somehow always involves doubling back on yourself. Over the last week, I've been surprised to find myself back in some new version of the ontological shock that I felt when I first recognized that there really was something to this whole UFO thing. To be honest, I've just been feeling really weird about the whole thing. And based on some private conversations that I've had with others in the community this week, I know I'm not the only one. So, whether you're brand new to this topic or have been studying it for decades, and whether you're listening to this when the episode comes out or months down the road, I think it's worth our time to take a minute to talk about ontological shock. Not just what it is, but how to cope, avoid some of the major pitfalls, and begin to get yourself reoriented in the strange new reality in which you find yourself. So, what does ontological shock look like? How can you tell if you or someone else might be experiencing it? It's important to note that ontological shock isn't a recognized medical condition, so it's not like we have a set of symptoms we can use to diagnose it. And ultimately, everyone deals with ontological shock differently depending on their personal beliefs, culture, values, and temperament. However, there are a few common things that people may experience, like cognitive dissonance, emotional turmoil, changes in behavior, a feeling of existential crisis, and even the reevaluation of one's beliefs. And these are just some of the things that someone going through a massive shift in their worldview might experience. And that will manifest differently for everyone.
All right, so you can listen to her podcast, which is wonderful, for more information. And so that's a really contemporary definition of ontological shock. I would say that characterizes the zeitgeist of the disclosure movement, let's say, around ontological shock. So let's keep going.
If you're not
So now we're going to get into the book Cultish by Amanda Montell. It's subtitled The Language of Fanaticism. The cover has a really great like 1950s or 40s style, like UFO, maybe 60s, I'm not sure. And it's got antenna and windows and stuff like that, but it's a flying saucer dish craft. And it's Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. So I'll just read from it because this book is all about the reframing of language in order to enact kind of cultish belief or behavior patterns. So she describes it really well in the passages I've selected. Creating a special language to influence people's behavior and beliefs is so effective in part because speech is the first thing we're willing to change about ourselves and also the last thing we let go. Unlike shaving your head, relocating to a commune, or even changing your clothes, adopting new terminology is instant and seemingly commitment-free. Let's say you show up to a spiritual meeting out of curiosity, and the host starts off by asking the group to repeat a chant. Odds are you do it. Maybe it feels odd and peer pressury at first, but they didn't ask you to fork over your life savings or kill anyone. How much damage can it do? Cultish language works so effectively and invisibly to mold our worldview in the shape of the gurus that once it's embedded, it sticks. You could fill a book longer than this one with a list of all the thought-terminating cliches, loaded language, us versus them labels, cultish religions around the world to use to convert, condition, and coerce their followers. To start, take a look at Shambhala, where thought-terminating cliches were disguised as wise Buddhist truisms. So the reason why I selected this passage and the reason why I'm actually talking about the cultish use of ontological shock is because I am a vowed Shambhala Buddhist. I've been I took the Buddhist refuge vow, the Bodhisattva vow in Shambhala Buddhism. I took the Shambhala vow, and I was preparing to take the Vajrayana vow as I was living at Karma Choling, the commune in Vermont that is described here. My mom got breast cancer, and I had to leave 2 months before the whole thing started to fall apart because the Me Too movement brought forward allegations that the guru, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, um, he brought forward allegations that he was raping practitioners and using his position of power to coercively enact his sexual dominance or whatever. And the governance council was keeping it quiet, and there was some allegations of money stuff. And oh my God, I was so grateful that I left to support my mom during that process instead of to be in the implosion of the community when that happened. But I had asked questions in Shambhala. This feels like a cult. Is it cult-like? You know, it's like on my 5th weekend level practice of increasing tuition fees or whatever, right? Like, this is a cult. No, it's not a cult. Everyone's really nice. Of course, it's not a cult. This is what they do in the East. They worship the gurus or whatever. At that point, it's really hard to understand. But I need to note that this was a lived experience of mine. And I said to myself, if ever I have those questions, if it feels like a cult and I'm asking questions, is it a cult? I'm not going to back down because people just say it's not a cult. I actually need to see proof and evidence it's not. And some of the evidence for me is the capacity to put forward an informed, kind, dissenting viewpoint from good leader. And or the set of central doctrines, right? To inquire about why we're holding certain beliefs in certain practices. If I'm not allowed to do that level of inquiry, I'm kicked out of a situation. I say it is cult-like because of this experience of quite literally being in a cult. So I do need to note, by the way, that I still practice my Shambhala Buddhist meditations, and that I have been practicing those in order to transmute a lot of the trigger I've been experiencing in this inquiry. So there is a baby and a bathwater situation. I say that a lot of the teachings of Buddhism are beautiful and wonderful, and I still hold those very dear to my heart, even those of Shambhala. But I do not look at the rapists who have guised their addicted raping activity as Buddhist teaching and crazy wisdom. I do not look at those as Buddhas anymore, let's say. So let's keep going on. In 2016, ex-Shambhalian Abby Shah moved to the group's idyllic Vermont commune to work the front desk and study meditation for what was only supposed to be a casual summer. A recent college graduate from California who relocated to New York City for a job in PR, Abby missed the co-op she lived in as a student at UC Santa Cruz. By her mid-20s, Abby was looking to press a spiritual reset button. That's when she dropped into a Tibetan mindfulness class and quickly fell in love with its teaching of basic goodness, the idea that all beings are born whole and worthy, but become lost along the way. That's why we meditate, to get back our basic goodness. Now, the phrase basic goodness is one of the first words that you get to in Shambhala Buddhism. Basic goodness, what does it mean? Oh, it's a complex mythology. It's hard to understand. It's a funny translation of Sanskrit or Tibetan. It's an experience. And I had a direct experience of basic goodness in meditation during a month-long meditation retreat during Karma Choling. It made me weep for about 2 days straight, and I still believe in it. I still believe in the inherent dignity of humanity. That's why I'm advocating for trust in our government over and above a paranoid, fearful, deluded view of the world where a fraction of our humanity is really exploiting all of us and maintaining this high level of control with space aliens or whatever. I'm saying, no, we're much more dignified than that. We have issues as a people, but it's not as systemic as what the disclosure narrative would put forward. Right, so let's keep going. When language works to make you question your own perspective, This is from Cultish, the book by Amanda Montell. When language works to make you question your own perceptions, whether at work or at church, that's a form of gaslighting. I first came across the term gaslighting in the context of abusive romantic partners, but it showed up in larger scale relationships too, like those between bosses and their employees, politicians and their supporters, spiritual leaders and their devotees. Across the board, gaslighting is a way of psychologically manipulating someone or many people such that they doubt their own reality, as a way to gain and maintain control. Psychologists agree that while gaslighters appear self-assured, they are typically motivated by extreme insecurities, inability to self-regulate their own thoughts and emotions. Sometimes gaslighters aren't even 100% aware that what they're doing is manipulative. In cultish scenarios, however, it's often a deliberate method to undermine the fundamentals of truth, so followers will come to depend wholly on the leader for what to believe. Now, I'm saying that something like this is happening with abductees' dreams. If you go back to the experiences that were put forward in the 80s and 90s by abduction researchers, many of them say it was a dream or like a dream. They think of it like a dream, and that it is only upon interaction with an interlocutor like Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs, John Mack, that these people are saying, no, it wasn't a dream, it was actually real. Right? I'm saying it can be a dream and real too, but the gaslighters, let's say, are saying, no, it was not a dream, it was definitely real, and therefore there's alien bodies and UFO craft. All right, so let's get to the standard definitions of words. This is Ontological Shock, comes from Wiktionary.org. It's the state of being forced to question one's worldview. This doesn't have a lot of citations behind it, and actually when I Google Ontological Shock definition Wikipedia, the term ontology comes up, and only this entry for Wiktionary comes up, which tells me there's not even a page for ontological shock in Wikipedia. So what is ontological? Again, this is from Wiktionary. Ontological means of or relating to ontology, of or pertaining to the nature of being or existence. What is ontology? It is in philosophy, it is the branch of metaphysics that addresses the nature or essential characteristics of being or of things that exist, the study of being qua being. In philosophy, again, in a subject view or worldview, the set of conceptual or material things or classes of things that are recognized as existing or are assumed to exist in context, and their interrelations. In a body of theory, the ontology comprises the domain of discourse and the things that are defined as existing, together with whatever emerges from their mutual implication. So I'm saying that this is likely the definition or that ontological shock refers to, because it is talking about things that can exist in our world. And we're saying psychic space aliens that have a predilection for fantastic sexual trauma are things that exist in our world if we believe abduction researchers and abductee testimony. Likewise, the revelations, the interrelations, the implications of that means that the government is hiding bodies and craft. That's another thing of ontology that we're dealing with. And so the ontological shock involves the injection of the notion of psychic space aliens who have fantastic sexual trauma predilections and their UFO craft that are sometimes hidden and captured by the governments. So it keeps going with several other definitions. Let's talk about shock. So it is defined as a sudden and a heavy impact. It is something so surprising, it is stunning. In psychology, it's a sudden or violent mental or emotional disturbance. In medicine, it involves electric shock as well as circulation. In medicine, a circulatory shock, there's a medical emergency characterized by the inability of this circulatory system to supply enough oxygen to meet tissue requirements, that sort of thing. So now let's get into cognitive dissonance. I say that ontological shock is nothing more than cognitive dissonance relabeled for a manipulative purpose. And the manipulative purpose is to adopt the ontological view that psychic space aliens are a real possibility and that the government is hiding them. So the APA defines cognitive dissonance as an unpleasant psychological state resulting from inconsistency between two or more elements in a cognitive system. it is presumed to involve a state of heightened arousal and to have characteristics similar to psychological drives, for example, hunger. Thus, cognitive dissonance creates a motivational drive in an individual to reduce the dissonance. See dissonance reduction. This is really important. It's a psychological drive akin to hunger, physiological drive akin to hunger. Wow, that's pretty big. And you move to it through a process called dissonance reduction. So when you click into that, it actually gives you a term that says cognitive reduction. And the APA defines that as the process by which a person reduces the uncomfortable psychological state that results from inconsistency among elements of a cognitive system, see cognitive dissonance. Dissonance can be reduced by making one or more inconsistent elements consistent with other elements in the system by decreasing the perceived importance of an inconsistent element or by adding new consistent elements to the system. Finally, self-affirmation theory postulates that merely affirming some valued aspect of the self, even if it is not directly related to the inconsistency, can reduce dissonance. See boistering of an attitude or forced compliance effect. So here it's important to note that if there is if there's a sort of some affirmation of a valued aspect of the self, that the whole self will reduce its cognitive dissonance, even if the system is not fully calibrated. So this is starting to expose the movement towards abduction and abductee identities, right? It's starting to expose it to psychological motives, right? Cognitive dissonance. A lot of people say, oh, abductees, right? John Mack will say that abductees do not share their testimony because it's hard to go on Oprah, or people are embarrassed, or they don't get money out of it, blah, 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 right? But ultimately, we know that there is a physiological drive called cognitive dissonance, and that it may be reduced through affirmations of valued aspects of the self, which may actually come through experiences like support groups or sharing testimonies to a kind and open interlocutor like a podcaster or something like that, or a New York Times article writer, right? Like that might actually be enough to move the cognitive dissonance associated with alien abduction and disclosure narratives into a state of cognitive reduction just because of that affirmation, right? Let's keep going. Paul Tillich's original 1951 definition of ontological shock. So how did I get there? And this is an example of literature review. This is what I'm doing. I've shared these screenshots because I don't think people out there know what a critical literature review is. I don't think people know how arguments are put forward. And if they did, I don't think they would be that upset with me for doing what I'm doing, right? So as a scholar, I have to ground my arguments in literature. What literature, you might ask? Well, it can't just be any literature. It has to be special literature, because the literature needs to be vetted and grounded and scholarly in some way, shape, or form. We usually call this peer-reviewed, but it can be literature that comes from the academic world. That means academic presses. That could be white papers from experts, but there's some level of rigor that needs to go into the literature. We might also refer to a canon, like the Western canon, where these are the great books of Western history, and it's assumed that most people who are educated have read them. I might cite those in my literature review as well. So when I'm looking to put together an inquiry or an argument for or against abduction testimony, right? I'm not sitting here listening to podcasts and going through Reddit like some people suggest, right? That researchers do, and put together their arguments based on hearsay or whatever. I'm actually doing those things, but then I'm coming to the literature databases and I'm typing in phrases that are related to the inquiry, and I'm seeing the results. I use the Google Scholar. That's a great search engine. And I searched the term ontological shock. There's 733 results. There's many, many more results generally for other phrases, so this isn't a lot. And then I go through these, and I go through probably 5 to 10 pages of results to see what's there, what are they talking about. And I look through a couple different databases. So I've got a ProQuest Central. I've searched for ontological shock, and I've said, I only want peer-reviewed papers about this. There's 55 results. So I go through and I try to make sense of that. So then I'm looking through and I scan through and I go, okay, the first thing in Google Scholar says why it takes ontological shock to prompt increases in small firm resilience, sense-making emotions, and flood risk. And that looks like it's a business assessment of ontological shock related to flood risk. And that seems like not the type of ontological shock I'm interested in. There's some other ones coming up, and I noticed that the literary depiction of ontological shock is in both. So I'm like, okay, let's go into that, because I actually haven't found much from Mack in these databases. I haven't found ontological shock related to aliens or even worldviews in the way that John Mack has been using it. So I then, in part of my critical literature review, I go, okay, so this literary depiction of ontological shock, an article in 2005 by Eric Levy, is relevant. So let me read part of that and see what I can figure out about ontological shock. Luckily, this is an academic kind of tone, so I can turn to the first paragraph to give me a really good introduction. So I will read that to you to start contextualizing ontological shock in a literature review. One of the most urgent, though often unrecognizable human needs concerns equilibrium, what Samuel Beckett terms the perpetual adjustment and readjustment of our organic sensibility to the conditions of the world. But the shifting circumstances of life, or even the peregrinations of thought about life, sometimes overwhelm or paralyze the equilibrating faculty of adjustment and withdraw or render irrelevant the familiar stabilizing reflexes. At its most extreme or most formal, this disorientation constitutes what Paul Tillich, in a famous passage of systematic theology termed ontological shock, to denote the mind's encounter with the threat of non-being when presuppositions regarding the structure and meaning of reality disappear into the abyss. On the psychological level, this ontological shock concerns the anxiety in which individuals are aware of their finitude, their ability, that is, to contain or assure the principles of their own continuation. On a metaphysical level, ontological shock concerns questioning of the primacy of being. Why is there something? Why not nothing? It is the task of metaphysics to determine the first principles of being and the necessity or certainty applying to them. Yet the project is not my concern here. In addressing the notion of ontological shock, my enterprise is not formally philosophical, but instead undertakes to explore the memenesis of the encounter with non-being in certain 20th century British and Irish literary texts. So this contextualizes Eric Levy's review of ontological shock, let's say. This was done in 2005, and he does not mention John Mack. All right, we know John Mack passed away in the early 2000s. 1999 was his Passport to Cosmos. 1994 was his Abduction book, and he's put forward ontological shock in many ways. He doesn't mention John Mack here regarding ontological shock. And they're using ontological shock in a different sense, right? Here we're talking about a threat of non-being that's metaphysical. Mack is talking about psychic space aliens who might kidnap your body. That's really different. Now, Mack will move his sense of ontological shock from that hypothesis to paradigms in general. And that's really important to understand. But there is a history of the word ontological shock associated with at least half a decade to a decade of pseudoscience that seems to have an impact here and now today that is enacting a political agenda. And therefore, we need to get some clarity regarding the way we're using the term ontological shock. So, to continue my exploration and literature review of ontological shock, I need to go back to Paul Tillich's 1951 definition of ontological shock in systematic theology. Systematic theology was published in 3 volumes. It's rather dense, and there are systems. It's a very dense or hard text, I guess, to read. I've tried it once, and it is regarded to be in the Western canon. It's not like top of the canon, but it's not. It is regarded to be within the scope of something someone might be aware of who has a liberal education. I'm going to read from this. There's about 3 large paragraphs. There are only 4 mentions of ontological shock in Paul Tillich's systematic theology that I could find in volume 1. And these are the only references I could find to ontological shock before John Mack, actually. And so I need to turn back to those. I'll simply read those. This is part of my critical literature reviewing process. I go, okay, I'm interested in this. Let me read the context, right? So I'm going to read that for you here and now. It starts out about ecstatic and ecstasy, and then we'll move into ontological shock. So this is from Paul Tillich's systematic theology. The so-called ecstatic movements are in continuous danger, to which they succumb more often than not, of confusing overexcitement with the presence of the divine spirit or the occurrence of revelation. Something happens objectively as well as subjectively in every genuine manifestation of the mystery. Only something subjective happens in a state of religious overexcitement, often artificially produced. Therefore, it has no revelatory power. No new practical or theoretical interpretations of what concerns us ultimately can be derived from such subjective experiences. Overexcitement is a state of mind which can be comprised completely in psychological terms. Ecstasy transcends the psychological level, although it has a psychological side. It reveals something valid about the relation between the mystery of our being and ourselves. Ecstasy is the form in which that which concerns us unconditionally manifests itself within the whole of our psychological conditions. It appears through them, but it cannot be derived from them. The threat of non-being, grasping the mind, produces the ontological shock in which the negative side of the mystery of being, its abysmal element, is experienced. Shock points to a state of mind in which the mind is thrown out of its normal balance, shaken in its structure. Reason reaches its boundary line, is thrown back upon itself, and is driven again to its extreme situation. This experience of ontological shock is expressed in the cognitive function by the basic philosophic question, the question of being and non-being. It is, of course, misleading if one asks with some philosophers, why is there something? Why not nothing? For this form of the question points to something that precedes being, from which being can be derived. But being can only be derived from being. The meaning of this question can be expressed in the statement that being is the original fact which cannot be derived from anything else. Taken in this sense, the question is a paradoxical expression of the ontological shock, and as such, the beginning of all genuine philosophy. In revelation and an ecstatic experience in which it is received, the ontological shock is preserved and overcome at the same time. It is preserved in the annihilating power of the divine presence, and is overcome in the elevating power of the divine presence. Ecstasy unites the experience of the abyss to reason in all its function, is driven with the experience of the ground in which reason is grasped by the mystery of its own depth and of the depth of being generally. Right, so this now we're talking about metaphysics. So why is there something rather than nothing is a fundamental question of metaphysics. Paul Tillich is talking about existential kind of crisis. Why is there something rather than nothing, right? This sort of experience, and so this sense of approaching nothingness or non-being in thought is similar to the Buddhist experience of emptiness or shunyata. So here we're talking about things that expand the worldview and mind, but are very different than psychic space aliens, right? We're talking about existential crisis. We're talking about being and non-being and that sort of thing. And some of the passages are really beautiful and applicable to the experiences that abductees report and the experience that John Mack is describing. But I need to really contextualize this. This is philosophy. This is metaphysics. This is existential thought. This is not dealing with the fact that space aliens exist. So we can turn to Mack's 1994 redefinition of ontological shock. So from his book, Abduction, this is a really important passage. At the end of the session, I instruct the experiencers to call either me or my assistant, Pam Casey, who is present during almost all the meetings, for a follow-up discussion. They usually do call, but if they do not, we call them. We are interested in how the experiencer has dealt with the powerful feelings that come up during the session, additional memories that surface, and how they are managing what I call the ontological shock of the abduction events. For until the powerful reliving that has occurred during the hypnosis session, the abductees may still have clung to the possibility that these experiences are dreams or some sort of curable mental disorder. The denial never disappears altogether, and a shock may recur, even after several hypnosis sessions, especially if a second abductee reports independently witnessing or experiencing during a shared abduction precisely what the first has reported. Regular support group meetings held in a friendly, private atmosphere where easy socializing is possible are an important aspect of my work with abductees, for members of this population feel extremely isolated and unable to communicate, except with other experiencers, a central aspect of their lives, without fear of rejection or outright ridicule. In the support group, they find a community of individuals with similar experiences. In the group, abductees can share what they have been through and are still experiencing, can keep up with what's going on in the UFO/abduction field generally, and can explore the various possible meanings and implications of their experiences in their individual and collective lives. So let's parse apart what has been said, because this is my argument rephrased by John Mack, right? So they can explore meanings and implications of their experiences within the support group. What are those experiences? Well, it's an abduction event, which is no longer considered to be a dream, right? It was a dream. Then there was an interaction with a hypnotist who is telling them it is not a dream. Then there may be a recurrence of the belief that it is a dream. And there's a second hypnosis session in which the hypnotist says it was not a dream, it was an abduction, a physical abduction event. And that's ontological shock. He's saying that that's ontological shock. I say that's cognitive dissonance. I say these people know they are dreams or some other curable mental disorder. Dreams are not a mental disorder. They're not curable. You can work with them. They are real and provide real experiences. But they are not waking phase. They don't have physical evidence in the same way. So I'm saying that he is checking up to see if his experiencers are having cognitive dissonance. He is then relabeling that ontological shock. He's reinitiating hypnosis, or he's bringing people into support groups. Please remember back to the APA definition of cognitive reduction, that cognitive reduction does not need to specifically focus on the elements of the cognitive system. It can simply just affirm a valued aspect of the identity. And that can come through this sense of feeling isolated in a group together, right? We're all isolated together, right, in our funny beliefs. And that can be enough, I think, to reduce the cognitive dissonance that is here now being relabeled as ontological shock. So let's turn to Mack's 1999 definition from Passport to the Cosmos. I have used the term ontological shock to describe the experience that many abductees go through at the moment when they can no longer deny that what they have undergone is in some way real, right? And I would say this is a very apt definition that is in line with my reading of the situation, right? They go, my dreamlike experience was also real, and there's a moment of cognitive dissonance. How is that possible? And the cognitive dissonance is derived from the monophasic bias or perspective. We'll talk about that shortly. But John Mack didn't know about that bias. He didn't know at all. They weren't doing... they were doing research back then. He could have known if he read more dream studies or paid attention to the women scholars of dream studies, Jane Gackenbach or Deidre Barrett. He would have known about more of these things, right? If he would have paid more attention to other literature, but he didn't. And so he assumed he was the expert on dreams and could make that judgment. And he made the judgment that these things cannot be dreams and real at the same time. And therefore, there must be some type of physical element to them, like the ET hypothesis put forward. All right. We need to contextualize this in dream studies. So, this is central to the argument, right? I go, the abduction experience seems like a special type of dream. Yes, it happens sometimes when you're driving or walking or whatever. Yes, it happens with other people. Yes, it involves anomalous physical events like genetic harvest or teleportation. And I say there are enough precedents in dream studies literature or other consciousness-based kind of spiritualist modalities that we can really go, hey, this is still dreamlike, even though there are anomalous physical elements. I say from looking into the anomalous physical evidence of body marks, right, of abduction marks, that does not hold water in terms of an argument because those marks were not collected in a scientific hypothesis, let's say. Those were anomalies collected, and there are a lot of confirmation biases and things like that going on. So I need to contextualize where we are with John Mack in this argument. And so I turn to the work Children's Dreams Reconsidered. It was a paper written by Mack and Dr. Album in 1980. It had it's like a follow-up review paper to his earlier work, and I'll just read some highlights here to get a sense as to what Mack's expertise is. So he writes, children's dreams reflect the mutual interaction of drive and ego development. They depict the most pressing concerns and tasks for children at different phases. For example, for children, dreams are expressive of fears and other intense feelings, fantasies, events of daily life, perceptions of important people, in short, what matters most deeply to children. As we have described, developmental stresses such as toilet training or Oedipal conflicts, as well as separations, birth of siblings, etc., will naturally find their way into the manifest contents of the children's dreams. This is all pretty standard dream stuff so far. Another reason a child's dream is so effectively powerful is that most often he experiences himself at the center stage of an intense drama. Dreams are thus narcissistically focused, i.e. they concern what the child is experiencing within himself and not the realities or problems of the outside world. Here we're expressing two biases. One is around the psychoanalytic perspective as relevant to science, and it is and isn't. There's a sense of, it's sort of like spiritual counseling or whatever, right? There's cultural issues associated with calling everything narcissistic and Oedipal, etc. And the other bias here is the monophasic bias that dreams are kind of epiphenomena of the body that are more or less meaningless unless they are psychoanalytically held, right? And that the problems of the outside world can't manifest within the dreams. And we'll see why that's relevant coming up. Nightmares are another area that offer opportunity to study the child's ego functioning in relation to dreaming. So Mack talks about that. A nightmare can reflect mastery and developmental advance or indicate areas of vulnerability that lead to the child's being overwhelmed with resultant impairment of ego functioning or lasting symptom formation. There has been little or no research on the occurrence or susceptibility to frequent nightmares applies to the concept of self, of how occurrence of or susceptibility to frequent nightmares applies to the concept of self, concept of a cohesive self, and impairments or vulnerabilities in the development of self. So here he's acknowledging that as of 1980, there was not research on recurrent nightmare experiences that is relevant. I say that the abduction event seems like a recurrent nightmare. And so this is really setting the ground to go, he does not know. And then finally, there is a rich literature concerned with the content analysis of dreams, including children's dreams. And he cites Hall and Van de Castle. And I include this highlight because this content analysis is one of the methods I use to explore dreams. Finally, he says, thus we may conclude in conclusion that if this review has any overriding purpose, it is to encourage a return to the study of dreams, especially the dreams of children. For it has been confirmed again and again that there is no shortcut to the discovery of the unconscious, and that dreams are its royal road. That's beautiful sentiment reflecting Sigmund Freud, and I'm reflecting that here. Let's talk about monophasic and polyphasic realities. This comes from a paper titled What Can We Learn from Shaman's Dreamings? It's published in the APA journal Dreaming by Laughlin and Rock in 2014. The second distinction we have to make between monophasic and polyphasic cultures. In modern materialist and technocratic societies, children are typically taught to ignore their dreams and to focus on adaptional interactions with the external physical world. The common cultural message is that dreams are not real, such as, "They're there, it's only a dream, dear." Dreams just happen, are figments of our imagination, have little value, and should be ignored. Schools typically do not address one's dream life, and information obtained in dream life bears little or no relevance to the waking world, except perhaps during the course of psychotherapy. These societies exhibit what we call monophasic cultures, which tend to skew the development of consciousness away from ASPs, which I believe is sort of like altered states, altered phases, other phases of consciousness, and towards perceptual cognitive processes oriented towards the external world, what we call being awake. Monophasic orientation toward dreaming leaves its mark on laboratory research and accounts of Western anthropologists for whom dreams must often be demythologized in order for them to become meaningful. That is, the dream must make sense to the rational thought in the waking state in order to make any sense of it at all. So extreme is the disattention to the alternative states in technocratic societies that compensatory spiritual movements have popped up over time to assuage the sense of spiritual poverty felt by many, including those movements focused on dreaming and neo-shamanism. And I would say, in line with Passport to Cosmos and Susan Clancy's 2005 book Abducted, right? Alien abduction is another one of these movements that have popped up that is apparently being motivated by a sense of spiritual yearning, as put forward by both Mack and Clancy. So that's something skeptics and credulous researchers agree upon yet again. Continuing on from the What Can We Learn from Shaman's Dreaming paper, aside from Western European societies, there are in excess of 4,000 cultures on the planet today, and 90% of them seek out and value experiences in ASPs, especially dreams. These are what we call polyphasic cultures, meaning that they value experiences had in the dream life, as well as those had in trance states, meditation states, drug and ritually driven visions, and so forth. These experiences are often conceived by people as different aspects of reality, not unreality. Indeed, people rarely, if ever, make a crisp distinction between the experienced reality and the extramental reality the way science does today. People in polyphasic cultures develop their sense of an identity by incorporating memories of experiences had in dreams and other ASPs, as well as those had in waking life. Indeed, they may not have a word in their native tongue that exactly connotes dream in our everyday English sense. What we call a dream may be considered by polyphasic people as experiencing another domain of reality. Dream experiences, just as waking experiences, inform the society's general system of knowledge about the self and the world. That is their cosmology, as well as the development of a person's identity. Right? So here, we're really establishing the knowledge that our belief about dreams informs our understanding and perhaps even how our identities develop, right? So in this way, Mack is citing his authority as a psychoanalyst, referencing and reviewing Freud and these other types of psychoanalytic dream interpreters. And that's really important to know, that they embodied a sense of this monophasic culture, even though they were moving towards dreams, right? Even though they were the only ones that seemed to value it, right? For a while there, they kind of incorporated this sort of monophasic bias. And so what would it look like if we were to believe that dreams were something more than just things that happened in our mind, that experiences could be both dreams and real? What would that look like to our development of the self, right? And we could perhaps even look to Carl Jung as an example of an actuated self relating to the UFO phenomena or whatever. All right. We can now turn to Krippner on dream enigmas. Please note this paper is from 1994, the same year that John Mack published Abduction. So this really proves to me that John Mack could have found precedence in dream studies for the extraordinary and anomalous aspects of abduction-like dreams or dream-like abduction events. He could have gone, oh, these things seem like dreams except for the fact they have strange physical components. He could have looked to see the anomalous studies of dreams, right? What are the anomalous aspects of dreams, instead of positing the alien abduction physical hypothesis. So reading now from Stanley Krippner, a well-respected dream researcher who wrote this article in 1994. Enigmatic, anomalous dream reports challenge the Western philosophical worldview. Hence, they are ignored or derided by most mainstream philosophers and scientists. Nevertheless, there is compelling evidence from research in parapsychology that at least some of these reports have consensual validation and waking life consequences. Shamanic models of reality, which reflect shamanic philosophies, provide anecdotal evidence congruent with parapsychological data and need to be reconsidered by the dominant Western academies because these models encompass anomalous dreams and because they furnish provocative data. It involves precognitive dreams in which you can tell the future, psychic dreams in which you have extrasensory perception like out of body, shared dream in which you have a shared dreaming experience which can explain a lot of corroborated witnessing, right? And then there's finally dream apports, in which there are objects from the dream world appearing in physical waking phase reality. Now, there's not a lot of evidence for apports, but I say there's more evidence for apports than UFO craft. And I say this because Krippner cited Tibetan Buddhists. I know from the spiritualist medium literature and seances and stuff like that, there is a tradition of producing apports through a variety of spiritualist means. Many of those are hoaxes, but they actually offer, you can find cut gems out there that people say are apports, and you could do science upon them in a way that you just can't do that with metamaterials unless you so happen to be in the so-called invisible college. So Gackenbach is a researcher who predicted the contact modalities in 1989. Right, so she really did. She researched the relationship of virtual reality and dreams. She observed the similarity of dreams, out of body, near death experiences, astral projection, and that sort of thing. And I find it wild that in 2017 or so, Ray Hernandez and Grant Cameron and others are putting forward the notion of the contact modalities. And they use this sort of quantum holographic, they have this, it's like quantum holistic holographic theory of consciousness, that sort of thing. That is like virtual reality this, virtual reality that, all these sorts of things. And yet Gackenbach really called it in 1989 that these things are experiences of consciousness, and that lucid dreaming is a very close and essential experience of pure consciousness, and that it is relevant to out-of-body, near-death, and these other experiences. So I'll simply read from her paper in a lucidity letter And this is Jane Gackenbach in 1989. In order to gain a theoretical understanding of the lucid dream, out-of-body experience, unidentified flying object abduction experience, and near-death experience, it is necessary, as William James, author of the 1902 classic The Varieties of Religious Experience, emphasized, to place things in their series. That is, identify the similarities and differences between experiences in order to understand their nature. The goal of such an inquiry is to identify a common state from which they derive and/or common mechanisms or structures. It is in tracing this line from three misattributions, OBEs, NDEs, and UFO abductions, to an accurate attribution, lucid dreaming, and on to the seat of all being, physical or mental, i.e. pure consciousness, that we can grasp the role of each experience plays in the development of higher states of consciousness. These three experiences, OBE, NDE, and UFO abduction, are some of the few imaginal realms that are more real than dreams, but like dreams, they carry the same inaccurate attribution. For most of us, dreams are the strongest experience of the mind that appear to occur outside of consensus reality. When we dream, while in the dream, it feels real. Even if we know it to be a dream while still in the dream, this is a lucid dream, it still feels real. But in the vast majority of dreams, we suffer from the peculiar single-mindedness in that we are sure we are awake. We have no idea that we are dreaming while we dream. So too, in the waking dreams of OBE, NDEs, and UFO abductions, we are certain that what is occurring is real in the same sense of waking consensus reality. In lucid dreams, we wake up to the dream reality without losing its felt sense of reality or object permanence. And so too, rarely might an experience of the other experiences accurately attribute the true nature of his or her state, but these accurate attributions are the exception to the rule. Exception, not the rule. So she's giving the example of like false awakening dreams. Like we can consider that. It's like those are dreams in which you've woken up and you're moving about your daily life and you think it's your daily life, but it's actually a dream. That's a really great example that can really set a precedent for the sort of sleep paralysis kind of dreamlike encounters we're seeing with the abduction experience. And so here, Gackenbach is really identifying that OBE, NDEs, and UFO abductions are experiences of pure consciousness. They are existing outside of, like, say, consensus reality, although there may be some intersection with it, and that there is an experience of misattribution, right? We have the bias that if we're awake and conscious, right, if we're conscious of our experience and doing things in a world that feels real, is real in the way of waking phase reality. And so that sense of misattribution, you're in the dream, you're like, I think this is, I think I'm me, right? Like that kind of thing. I feels real in the way of real as waking phase, right? So here, this sense of ability to accurately attribute, Gackenbach is noting that there's not a lot of experiencers who can accurately attribute the true nature of their state. And I say this is because not a lot of people are skilled in mindfulness and lucid dreaming who are approaching these subject matters, right? So if it is something like a dream, then you must be skilled in lucid dreaming in order to understand where you're at or orient or figure it out. And so if you don't have experience in false awakening or lucid dreaming or mindfulness in that way, you might not have enough experience to correctly attribute the nature of your experience as you're having it or in retrospection. And that's totally fine. And there's like cultural reasons for it, and that's the monophasic and polyphasic bias. I say that if we turn to polyphasic communities and ask them about their experiences, they likely might say something different. Now, that is a really challenging problem because we're internet connected all over and there's globalization and there's so much colonization of indigenous perspectives. So we'd really have to look for that. We can't just go, hey, Credo Motu from South Africa is saying this. He's saying it to a Western interlocutor in a best-selling book. That means there is some level of permeation of the colonizing monophasic worldview into that indigenous worldview. All right. Let's keep going to the International Association of the Study of Dreams, their Dreamwork ethics statement. So I say that if all of these are dreams and this is dreamwork, then we must follow the ethics and epistemology of dreamwork. And so what is that? The IASD celebrates the many benefits of dreamwork, yet recognizes that there are potential risks. IASD supports an approach to dreamwork and dream sharing that respects the dreamer's dignity and integrity, which recognizes the dreamer as the decision maker regarding the significance of the dream. Systems of dreamwork that assign authority or knowledge of the dream's meaning to someone other than the dreamer can be misleading, incorrect, and harmful. Ethical dreamwork helps the dreamer work with his or her own dream images, feelings, and associations, and guides the dreamer to more fully experience, appreciate, and understand the dream. Every dream may have multiple meanings, and different techniques may be reasonably employed to touch these multiple layers of significance. So here it's really an ethical principle that the dreamer is the decision maker regarding the significance of the dream. Now, if you have a dream that you need work with, right, and you say, this is a dream, but it feels real, and you go to a hypnotist who says it's actually real and not a dream, right, that is a decision regarding the ontological significance of the dream. Is it a dream and real? Is it real or a dream? Are these space aliens violating you physically? Is this a spiritual experience? Those decisions get to be made by you, the dreamer, not someone else. So when you go to a hypnotist and they hypnotize you to believe it's real, and you go back to them saying, I think this is still a dream, they hypnotize you again, and you go back to them and they say, oh no, you're experiencing ontological shock. Just go to my loving, supportive experiencer support group, right? And then you believe, right? You need help believing the truth of the matter, that you didn't actually experience a dream, you experienced a physical waking kind of interaction with space aliens, right? This is starting to look like a repeated coercion of a belief system that's violating this principle of, it's called assignment of authority. So you are no longer the decision maker regarding the significance of your dream. Now, I say that as a dreamer, you are powerful and not a victim. You have engaged that other person for other purposes than, say, truth or inquiry. You have perhaps received validation of valued aspects of yourself, and you're receiving that in that relationship. And that is a totally valid means to put forward your testimony and support other people. That's what happens in spiritual support communities. However, to really keep coming back to why I'm talking about this is those testimonies of abductees are now being used to support a political agenda that exposes those testimonies to critique. And that's why I'm talking about it. And I'm saying that this sense of saying someone's dream is actually a real thing, a UFO abduction, and not just a dream, that's unethical dream work. And we need to call that out so that can just be acknowledged, because other people will call that out, we'll call that out. This is literature review. This is obvious in the literature, and that's what I'm talking about. Let's continue. So this is my hypothesis at the moment. At the moment, this is my hypothesis. I can hold a hypothesis that I don't believe in. I can hold hypotheses that are offensive to people. I can do those things because it's just a hypothesis. We're just an inquiry. I'm documenting my inquiry here. I'm sharing my insights and observations, and I'm inviting feedback. So please give me feedback on this hypothesis. I'm not saying this is the truth. I'm saying I'm considering this as an interpretation of my experience. So this hypothesis. Ontological shock is a manipulative term used to gaslight the cognitive dissonance one feels when a coercive interlocutor implants a false belief system specifically regarding ET-NHI dream encounters. So I'm saying that ontological shock is a manipulative term. It takes the phrase, it takes a natural cognitive dissonance one would feel when someone says, hey, your dream is not a dream, it's real. Okay, there's cognitive dissonance there. We need to reduce that cognitive dissonance. How do we do that? We relabel it as ontological shock. And we say that that ontological shock gives you membership into a unique community of experiencers. Right? This ontological shock is a key for you to join this support group where you feel validated in aspects of yourself. That's the hypothesis. That it's not actually validating the fact that your experience was real and not a dream. It's validating some aspect of yourself that's kind of associated with this, but not. So ontological shock, when you call the cognitive dissonance you're experiencing related to the ET-NHI phenomena, your experience cognitive dissonance, when you call it ontological shock, that gives you membership in a community, and that membership in the community satisfies other psychological motivations than truth. That's totally fine, except for the fact that this community and its testimonies are used to support a political agenda that has no physical evidence for it. That's the disclosure, crash retrieval disclosure political agenda. There's no physical evidence for it we've seen, but people are pointing to abductee testimony and experiencer testimony as why we should hold the disclosure crash retrieval narratives as a valid thing. So it's a complex situation here. All right, the hypothesis, I'll just read this now. ET-NHI encounters are primarily dreamlike and therefore do not constitute an ontological threat or even revelation, except to weird monophasic cultures. Encounters co-create lived experience, and therefore alien abduction motifs may be unnatural and not universal. Right? So there may be a universal contact phenomena with NHIs or ETs or whatever, but it might come through a co-creative way, like through angel visitations or fairy visitations or some other means. The ET-NHI hypothesis may be unnatural, although the lived experience of ET-NHI encounters and even abduction may be a natural event. So that's kind of complex. Therefore, ontological shock is not about an external reality shocking one's worldview. Rather, it is about an external worldview shocking one's reality. Right? I'll say that again. Therefore, ontological shock is not about an external reality shocking one's worldview. It is about an external worldview shocking one's reality. So let's talk about hypnotic false memories. I like this because in 1996, these researchers really said, hey, it seems like hypnosis really is useful, or therapy or interlocution is useful to generate false memories. And this really points to this sense of cognitive reduction as a motivating factor. They describe the process by which a UFO abduction memory becomes integrated in the self. One, a person is predisposed to accept the idea that certain puzzling or inexplicable experiences may be telltale signs of UFO abduction syndrome, amnesia or paralysis. I say it's primarily dreams, and we'll see that shortly. Two, the person seeks out a therapist whom he or she views as an authority and who is at the very least receptive to the explanation. I say that can be a support group or podcaster or anyone else that brings forward a public testimony. Three, alternatively, the therapist frames the puzzling experience in terms of an abduction narrative. Four, alternative explanations of the experience are not explored. Five, there is increasing commitment to the abduction explanation and increasing anxiety reduction associated with ambiguity reduction. Is it a dream? Is it real? Is it a dream? Is it real? What is this sleep paralysis? Oh, thank God, I know what it is. It's aliens. And there's a group of people who are suffering from that. And that validates my sense of self. 6, the therapist legitimizes or ratifies the abductee's experiences, which constitutes additional positive reinforcement. 7, client adopts the role of victim or abductee, which becomes integrated into psychotherapy and the client's view of the self. So let's get to really why I'm talking about this is central to my argument. The 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, I say, is definitive of the UFO abduction syndrome, and it is the moment where this sort of folklore moved into clinical science And I say the 1992 booklet is when John Mack introduced the UFO abduction syndrome. He brought this sort of folklore history, kind of spooky tales type notion into clinical science in 1992. That's the argument. And from there, I say that it's now harmful pseudoscience, and that because it appears to be clinical science, it is being used to substantiate political agendas based upon its testimony. The political agendas go, oh, it's valid because this looks like clinical science. They're not turning back to the book Abducted by the Lorenzens. They're not turning back to the Betty and Barney Hill case. They're turning back to John Mack because it looks like clinical science. So we need to turn back to say, how does that one definitive document treat the abduction experience? What do they say it originally is? And I'm going to provide a series of quotes that will, beyond a reasonable doubt, establish the fact that the UFO abduction syndrome appears to be derived from an interpretation of dreams and dreamlike phenomena. Abstract. This is from the booklet. The results of an ostensible UFO abduction syndrome are symptoms akin to post-traumatic stress, with subjects reporting diffuse anxieties, disturbing dreams, sleep disturbances, and imagery related to the abduction experience. UFO abduction memories may be as unacceptable to the subject or therapist or both, so eliciting them may require additional effort, that of hypnosis, right? It is very important to note that since this has been published, there has been peer-reviewed scientific studies about the generation of false memories through hypnosis, as well as the psychophysiological effects of the script-driven imagery associated with abduction, right? And those effects are PTSD, right? So here, this is sort of tautological, right? It's tautological, and we have to see it's self-referential, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. The clinical description of the UFO abduction syndrome. Typically, the patients might enter therapy with complaints about anxiety, depression, phobias, or a pattern of frightening dreams. These patients might also have dreams or vague remembrances of such images as hospital operating rooms, bright lights, huge-eyed alien beings, or impossible animals such as very large owls or spiders. So at this point, in terms of dream studies, there's a huge prevalence rates of fantastic creatures and dreams, and variety of experiences. And we have like 3 to 4 dreams a night. They say we kind of recollect 3 to 4 dreams a week. So we're dealing with orders of magnitudes more unremembered experiences than remembered that come through vague impressions. So at this point, this is sort of like a spiritual medium going, does somebody in the room have a grandma whose name starts with J? I see a J. Maybe it's a G. Maybe it's a G. So now at this point, we're like increasing the apparent relevance of this phenomena through just appropriating natural dreaming experiences. And continuing on with the UFO abduction syndrome, the unusual personal experiences, many stories are now surfacing from children as young as 2 years old who describe abduction experiences. Typically, a child might report that funny little men with big black eyes take him into the sky to see the little space doctors in the round exam room. The child reports that the doctors talk to me in my head and tell me things that it was just a dream. Oh my God, these stories might easily be passed off as typical fantasies until the child is actually found absent from his crib, dazed in a nearby field, or outside of the bolt-locked home at night. Peculiar incisions, needle marks, triangle bruises, scoop marks, scars, and unknown origins seem to add further evidence as to the existence of some kind of anomalous event. Right? The body marks I've looked into, you can look at my book, Field Guide to Anomalous Geometry. I say that they can be used as oracles and sources of meaning and could be a great scientific exploration, but we have not yet anyone has done a scientific inquiry into these things, and therefore they cannot be used as physical evidence for a physical hypothesis, because that would require scientific scientific levels of evidence, and we are just not there. So regarding the survey design, the authors say, at the beginning of this project, the decision was made not to ask any direct questions about the UFO abduction phenomena, since, as we have seen, these experiences are usually recalled partially in separate dream-like fragments and through unusual periods of missing time, which we decided to ask only about specific symptoms. Few abductees are fully consciously aware of their unenviable status, and fewer still, we thought, would admit being so aware to a Roper representative. So even now they're saying, we're looking at dreams and dreamlike phenomena, and we're being shady about that, is what they're saying. All right. This is a really important interview. This is John Mack with Peter Faust on Oprah in 1994. This is very important because it demonstrates the influence of the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. There'll be phrases that he uses. Thousands, if not millions, of people are abductees. Children as early as 2, right? That demonstrate he is citing the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet on Oprah in 1994 to establish the credibility of the abduction phenomena and, more importantly, sell his best-selling book, which apparently he received $250,000 in early 90s monies. That's like $500,000 today to publish that book. So he's using unethical Dreamwork to put forward a testimony, Peter Faust's testimony, that Peter Faust really wanted to believe was a dream, but didn't because he related to John Mack, the hypnotist, right? And this is all happening in 1994, 2 years after the conference at MIT, 2 years after many skeptics responded to the poll with damning criticism that he did not respond to. This is why I say it's a harmful pseudoscience. And this one interview in that context is why I feel it is important to look into the work of Dr. John Mack. And this is why I am not attacking like a reputed researcher and a well-intentioned researcher. He can have really good intentions, but it looks to me like this is unethical and coercive dream work for personal profit at this point in time in 1994. Yes, his subsequent work with Passport to Cosmos and his beautiful work with experiencers really do contextualize his early 90s research. But the fact is, he went on Oprah to say these things. And that had an impact on our society that we're still feeling today. All right, let's get into it.
Exactly the quote, but something like that. So do you remember when you were 8 years old being abducted, or when you were younger feeling this whatever?
No, I had memories when I was an adult, 3 or 4 years ago. And then in regression is when I went back in time, saw myself as a child having the abductions from the time I was about 8 years old.
Okay.
So more and more came out under regression.
Okay, can you tell me what you remembered when you were regressed?
I remember a light hitting me in the forehead, aliens in my room, being lifted up into a spaceship.
What they look like? They look like they did in the Close Encounters of the Third Kind?
Let's pause here for a moment because I really need to advocate for experiencer testimony here and now. So I have been saying a lot of damning things about John Mack and the sense of unethical dream work and coercive belief patterns, Experiencer testimony is absolutely sacred. The stuff that comes out of regression hypnosis is absolutely sacred and meaningful. They're sacred in the same way that dreams are sacred, right? And that's why I am sensitive to the fact that these experiencer testimonies are being used to fuel a political agenda and not necessarily in a clear way. In this case, I say that all of regression hypnosis, we don't need to throw away regression hypnosis. We need to reframe the language. I say that the phrase remember, right? He's like, do you remember this? He goes, I remember this. I say, if we actually replace the word remember with something like a complex system of intuition provided insight or meaning regarding these inquiries or whatever, or I experience in the regression this sort of thing, not I remember, right? So the I remember actually here is standing in for a complex system of intuition that is meaningful and relevant to some phases of consciousness, but I'm arguing not necessarily to the waking phase in a naive way as being put forward here and now.
No.
No?
Similar, but not quite the same. Not at all.
Okay.
I remember lying on a table, lying naked, having probes put around me, experiments done on me, looking in my eyes.
So here, we do have to say that there is a fantastic sexual trauma element here. Oprah in the beginning said, and they were intimate with you. So she implies that, and here there's an implication of probing and naked and exposure and fantastic sexual trauma. Fantastic sexual trauma narratives are associated with, as a form of proof, and they've been used as a form of proof since medieval witch hunting days. And I talk about the David Laycock's paper, Carnal Knowledge, and I say if anyone's really triggered by this notion of fantastic sexual trauma, they should read that paper and just understand the context.
My ears,
So
around my
this
body.
happened to you, what, in the middle of the day, or you...
They happen at nighttime.
Okay, so when you're sleeping? Or
They-
not sleeping?
What happened was, for me, the conscious memories that I had was, in the middle of the night, I woke up, very conscious, walked over to my...
At this point, Oprah's really honing in on a set of really good questions. Is this just a dream, right? And he's saying consciously he woke up, right? Now, we know false awakening dreams. We know sleep paralysis dreams. We know there are like REM body disorder stuff where you can, it's like like active sleepwalking. There's a lot of stuff that can happen at night that's just wild. And so we need to account for those things and be aware of those before we make conclusions about, like, if you're in a bed and you wake up in the middle of the night and interact with a dreamlike creature and you go back to sleep and you wake up the next day and you have emotions because of that, this sounds like a dream that is misattributed to reality, of waking phase reality, not of actual waking phase visitation. And so that's why I read John Mack's writing on dreams, so you could say to yourself, do you believe that John Mack actually studied false awakening dreams to the degree that he could make this judgment or not?
Exactly the quote, but something like that. So do you remember when you were 8 years old being abducted, or when you were younger feeling this whatever?
No, I had memories when I was an adult, 3 or 4 years ago. And then in regression is when I went back in time, saw myself as a child having the abductions from the time I was about 8 years old.
Okay.
So more and more came out under regression.
Okay, can you tell me what you remembered when you were regressed?
I remember a light hitting me in the forehead, aliens in my room, being lifted up into a spaceship.
What they look like?
Um,
They look like they did in the Close
hang on
Encounters
a
of the Third
second.
Kind?
no,
We went through this again. Ugh. There's a couple of things we need to
Exactly
see
the
here.
quote, but something including one where Peter was under hypnosis.
that was the last thing I wanted in my life. Why was I terrified? What was...
You had
Several hours later, I woke up and had these
Here we are.
intense emotions associated with the experience that just, I couldn't fathom. Like, why was I so scared? Why was I terrified? What was...
you had a bad dream.
That's what I thought. That's what I wanted to believe. That's what I wanted to believe for years.
This is essential to my argument. Peter Faust is saying, I had a bad dream. I wanted to believe it for years. Oprah's saying it. If it looks like a dream and it smells like a dream, it's probably a dream, even if a Harvard expert who is selling a book about the fact it's not a dream tells you it's not a dream. Oh my God, hang on. Keep clicking off of this. We need to get into this.
Exactly the quote, but his therapy sessions with Peter, including a bad tabloid story.
Until...
And why do you want to believe that? Because
Because
are,
I don't want to think I'm abducted by aliens. That was the last thing I wanted in my life.
This sounds like a bad tabloid story.
That's what it sounded like to me for a long time.
But Dr. Mack tape recorded several of his therapies.
And I'm going to click back to one final thing. I'm not sure what's going on with the slides.
Exactly the
They're
quote,
not.
but something like that. So
It made me believe that something happened because I couldn't deny
they say they have experienced you with your credentials coming from
Yeah,
all
here
of
we
this.
go.
there was something real there.
Dr. Mack, what does this all mean? What is all of this, you know, the book where you talk to hundreds of patients and describe in detail what they say they have experienced, you with your credentials coming from Harvard. What do you think this all means?
Well, let me explain first why I conclude.
So you with all your credentials from Harvard, right? So this is establishing the social kind of proof that he is speaking as a medical doctor, as clinical scientist, as a representative of Harvard, as a representative of, like, he's holding, he has an MD. So that's really important. So this contextualizes it. And so he's using his credentials as a Harvard professor and a medical doctor to then put forward what he's going to say next.
Exactly the quote, but something like that. So do you remember when you were 8 years old being
Sorry, it
abducted?
keeps
or
going back
when
and
you were-
forth.
I concluded this
Here we
is
are.
not psychiatric, why these people are not psychiatrically disturbed.
What?
Well, let me explain first why.
Means?
Here we are.
Well, let me explain first why I concluded this is not psychiatric, why these people are not psychiatrically disturbed.
What?
Because I was concerned, when I first heard about this, I thought this must be madness. But when I heard that hundreds of thousands of people
Why
all
not a
over the
publicity
country,
stunt? Why not just
because these people, like Peter, I can't tell you how difficult it is to get people to go on television to talk about this. People are not interested in being before the public. They're very ashamed because they get ridiculed, humiliated about it. This is not something anybody does. This is not a club anybody wants to belong to. This is not something people
I doubt that.
do because they want to be filmed or get on publicity. It's very difficult to
that.
get people to come forth and acknowledge they've had these experiences.
Doesn't
Yes,
look
and
like it.
I've read interviews with people who have come forward years ago who wish that they hadn't at this point. Go ahead.
So when I heard of it, hundreds of thousands of people all over the country, from various polls, we know maybe even millions of people have had
This is it.
very similar experiences. They don't know each other. The details that they're describing were not in the media. They have nothing to gain by it. They feel ashamed about it. That's number one. When I also heard that this was occurring in children as young as 2 or 3 years old, that ruled out
More proof.
personality explanations. It's associated with UFOs independently observed by witnesses, by media, by neighbors. It's also associated with physical findings and, as said before, the people, when examined, are not psychiatrically disturbed. So the only thing that behaves like that is real experience.
Yeah, you say that
Dreams
it's
do
trauma,
not behave-
trauma, that it's trauma.
It's
not-
traumatic.
yeah.
Real experiences are the only thing that occurs like that. Psychosis isn't like that. Madness is not like that. Dreams are not like that. Fantasy is not like that. Now, if these are real experiences, what is going on? What's the source of these experiences? That's an
Yeah,
interesting.
that's
So that sense of dreams are not like that, fantasy is not like that. Actually, fantasy and dreams are like that. We have literature regarding fantastic encounters with fairy beings and gods and angels. We have fantastic abduction literature, right? Like we know that hypnosis is dreamlike, right? These are dreamlike experiences people are talking about. So he is saying dreams aren't like that he's said that multiple times. He's like, dreams are not like that. Dreams are not like that. I actually say the dreams he studied likely are not like that. Right? The dreams studied in psychoanalysis are likely not like this. But there are many other types of dreaming. That's one of the reasons why the IASD, the International Association of the Study of Dreams, say that anyone who is engaged in ethical dream work needs to engage a practice of cross-cultural comparison of dreams, needs to study anomalous and extraordinary dream states, and needs to practice dream work themselves, because that's the only way you can really gain a foundation by which to make those judgments as to whether or not things are like dreams. And I say that John Mack did not do that in 1994. I say that he's relying upon the 1992 unusual personal experiences, booklet in at least 2 of the facts. The thousands, if not millions of people are abductees, and children as early as 2. Those are facts that we saw were directly presented in the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet, as well as the appropriation of natural kind of sleep paralysis dream phenomena into the UFO abduction syndrome. So I'm saying in 1994, he is parroting the facts or findings of the UFO abduction syndrome in the Unusual Personal Experiences booklet in order to sell his books, while putting these things forward using his MD credentials and his Harvard status. And I say that this is particularly problematic because this sort of testimony is used to enact a political drama today, and that has no really bearing to respect experiencer testimony. That's kind of what I'm putting forward. So let's keep going. All right, so we now can offer some provisional conclusions. Once again, these are provisional conclusions. I'm on an inquiry. I'm putting forward these notions kind of as a devil's advocate because I need people to actually respond to me and give me feedback. I don't need people to just push me out of situations or whatever, or not tell me where I'm wrong. I'm doing this for the community because I believe the community, the experiencer and abductee community, need to consider these relevant literary facts in order to produce a literary argument against them. I'm saying this is the state of the literature as I see it. And I would love to change the state of the literature in collaboration with the experiencer community and my PhD research. I would love to do that. But we need to acknowledge where we are here and now today before we can make a substantial contribution to the literature. All right. So ET-NHI testimony and support may be like Dreamwork. I see that ET-NHI testimony generation and support appears to be driven by interlocutor activities. ET-NHI testimonies appear to be derived from anomalous events and dreams or dreamlike intuitions. Therefore, the ethics and epistemology of Dreamwork are most applicable to the generation of experiencer testimony and experiencer support communities. All right. Physical waking phase UFO abduction testimony may be derived from unethical dream work. The UFO abduction syndrome appears derived from dreams or dreamlike intuitions. Most experiencers describe their experiences as dreams, then as abduction only after interlocutor interventions, like talking to John Mack or joining a support group or talking to a podcast or consuming podcast material about alien abductions, etc., and thinking, maybe me too. Mack, Jacobs, and Hopkins were not dream experts. Only Mack was familiar with dreams, but only from a primarily Freudian perspective. Known dream experts had already observed connections between OBE, NDE, lucid dream, and alien abduction experiences. Abduction testimony essentially relies upon interpretation of the ontological significance of dreams. Right? Abduction testimony essentially relies upon the interpretation of the ontological significance of dreams. Peter Faust presented what appears to be a sleep paralysis dream. John Mack says, no, ontologically, that's real and not a dream. That's the ontological significance. He made that decision, not Peter Faust. Peter Faust wanted to believe it was a dream. John Mack hypnotized him again, put him in a support group, and then wrote a book about it. Therefore, Mack's interpretation of his subject's dreams may have violated the assignment of authority ethical principle of Dreamwork. Now, that Dreamwork principle was not written at the time. It's really important to know that. It was written probably 10 years later, maybe 20. So that's important to know. I mean, John Mack was working in a different world, and a lot of his actions are really understandable in that context. But we do not need to really support. It's like reading H.P. Lovecraft, right? He wrote a lot of good stuff, but we really do not need to take his social commentary to heart. In the same way, we can really value the essential, enduring contributions of Mack without continuing his unethical dreamwork practices. Okay, here's a big conclusion. Ontological shock may just be gaslit cognitive dissonance. Ontological shock may just be gaslit cognitive dissonance. So ontological shock was originally defined in 1951 by Tillich regarding a very specific metaphysical interpretation of ontology. This is like the sense of existential non-being or something like that. Mack redefined ontological shock in 1994 to refer not to like an existential crisis, but to the crisis of having absurd elements within the cognitive system. Those absurd elements are psychic, sexually traumatizing, space aliens and their UFO craft, the fact that the sleep paralysis dreams aren't dreams, but reveal the reality of this set of beings within an ontology. So he's moving it from a general metaphysical understanding of ontology to a very specific type of ontology. And that move actually is not in line with the usage Tillich originally put forward, right? It's a subtle but different situation. It is regarding disbelief that dreamlike intuitions of ET NHI encounters are real, right? So the ontological shock may be modeled as cognitive dissonance. The experiencer believes the dream may be real, but does not understand how. This is because of the monophasic bias. They don't understand that dreams can be real and dreams at the same time. Therefore, they are looking for how these real dreamlike experiences can be actually real and not dreamlike. The interlocutor then suggests that the dream is not a dream, but that it is real. The truth is that it may be both a dream and real at the same time. So if the experience is modeled as anything other than a dream or real, it involves cognitive dissonance, right? Therefore, Mack may have unconsciously labeled cognitive dissonance as ontological shock to unconsciously coerce the experiencers to adopt the UFO abduction syndrome identity. He may have unconsciously labeled cognitive dissonance as ontological shock to unconsciously coerce the experiencers to adopt the UFO abduction syndrome identity. So why does all this matter? Why would I make these triggering and likely offensive observations? I keep coming back to that, and let's see. I really need to be. I'm not doing this just for fun. I'm not picking fights just for fun. I didn't, sit in my room thinking, what do I want to spend my life doing? Oh, I want to pick a fight with Dr. John Mack and his legacy. I didn't do that. I wasn't like, oh, that seems like fun. Let me secretly join abduction communities and pick fights about John Mack, about well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-respected researchers. I was like, oh, that, I wasn't thinking that's a great way to spend my mornings and afternoons and weekends. That's a great way to spend my PhD research. It's like, I didn't do that. I said, I want to study ET contact and dreams. And I followed the literature, and that clearly and directly led me to the 1992 Unusual Personal Experiences booklet. That clearly and directly led me to Mack's research. And it clearly and directly led me to the the lineage holders of those storytelling traditions, Bud Hopkins to Leslie Kean, John Mack to Blumenthal, those to David Grush, and to the modern disclosure movement. I wasn't sitting here thinking, hey, it would be fun to trigger myself and other people in this inquiry. And I just need to say that because this is relevant. And why is that relevant? Well, we are dealing with the lived experience of reality, regardless of hypothesis. People have had these experiences of abduction, and that is sacred testimony. And we need to honor those things as sacred, not exploit them for a political agenda. If the ETNHI contact experience is dreamlike and real, then we will not be able to effectively study them, support experiencer communities, or convince the mainstream that these testimonies are meaningful unless we acknowledge The lived reality of experiences that includes anomalous physical effects like teleportation, genetic harvest, marks upon the body, trace evidences, like teleportation stuff, like that's all wild stuff that I am not arguing against. I am arguing for the exploration of those experiences and the scientific study of those experiences, but we need to know what phase of consciousness most of those experiences are mediated in order to actually study them. If they are dreamlike, then let's study them at the level of dream. If they are physical, then they should have physical evidences that support scientific levels of evidence, right? If they don't have that, then let's look to where there is actually evidence for those things. We need to acknowledge the dreamlike nature of their reality. We need to say, these experiences are dreamlike. Every experiencer that supported Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, John Mack sort of said, hey, this seems like a dream. Is this real or not? And they said, no, it's real. But we have to say, yes, actually, that intuition that the experiencer had, the intuition that Peter Faust had, that he talked about on Oprah, that intuition that these things are dreams and real needs to be acknowledged and held as sacred. Therefore, mainstream culture may continue to reject experiencer testimonies unless presented with epistemologies appropriate to their nature, right? We cannot foist cognitive dissonance upon mainstream culture and call it ontological shock. They will call our bullshit and reject our testimony. They say, this doesn't make sense. And they'll say that because they do not have the lived experience of ET-NHI contact in that way. There's some people that do and some people that don't. Some people who remember their dreams, some people who don't. Some people who have sleep paralysis, some people who don't. Some people who lucid dream and some people who don't. And those people who don't have no context for relating to these extraordinary stories, but they might get the fact that these are dreamlike. And that if we are honest about the language we're using and about the testimonies we're dealing with, then the mainstream people may actually accept our testimony as relevant to consensus reality rather than push aside those testimonies. Another reason is that politics and disclosure activism seem to define the experiencer community, but not experiences. It appears that politics and disclosure activism define the experiencer community, which relies upon the unconscious bias that these experiences must have a physical waking phase component, and therefore the government is hiding craft and bodies. If the ET-NHI contact event is dreamlike and real, then we do not need to assume craft and bodies. The physical ET hypothesis has dominated and arguably created the disclosure movement. Therefore, support testimony research communities dedicated to disclosure unconsciously put forward the physical ET hypothesis as a doctrine of faith for their participation, right? If I have to believe the government is hiding craft and bodies and that disclosure is necessary to validate my lived experience of contact, then something is off here, right? There may not be any bodies and craft, and that's okay. We can have dialogue in community without relying upon the notion that the government needs to validate our experiences. What would it look like if we valued direct experiencer testimony over and above the physical ET hypothesis? What would it look like? All right, so I have an answer for that. And this comes from the Johnny Mack Institute. This comes from a post they wrote about the Priests of High Strangeness article by Carol Rainey. If you don't know what that article is, please read it. It is a damning article about Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs and how they lost their way. And it really has been one of the motivators for me to question a number of different widely accepted narratives here. I'll simply read from John E. Mack Institute's statement regarding this article. In the Priests of High Strangeness article, an essay by Carol Rainey published in the premier issue of Paratopia, the author asserts that since asserts that the sensational cases published in Bud Hopkins' Intruders and Witness and in David Jacobs' Secret Life and the Threat are not the norm for abduction experiences. She suggests that Hopkins, her husband of 10 years, was too easily lured by stories that bear little resemblance to typical alien encounters. The cloak and dagger story of Linda, allegedly abducted from her New York apartment on a beam of light in full view of the United Nations ambassador, is one of several cases which she knows Hopkins promoted even as discrediting evidence piled up. This might be the famous case. An allegation that David Jacobs' objectivity had been compromised by paranoia is also referenced. That is such a kind way to describe what David Jacobs actually did. Read the article and just observe the kind of tact and compassion that the John E. Mack Institute has. And I wonder actually if that level of tact and compassion is truly tact and compassion to Emma Woods. I wonder if it is tact and compassion to the people who have adopted a fearful and paranoid worldview of David Jacobs because his books were best-selling, but this article had no level of staying power compared to those books, right? It took me several years to find this article after I started researching abduction. And that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about this, is no one told me about this. And this is central to abductology. All right, let's keep going. We thought some may wonder whether this article discredits experiencers and alien encounters in general. We feel that it is not meant to. Rather, it is a criticism of researchers being lured by their own expectation of what alien encounter experiences is and what sort of cases promise proof, when the reality could be that the nature of alien encounters is far stranger than one may expect and may, by its very nature, not be able to provide a familiar kind of proof. So this language is what I'm addressing here and now today. This sort of, it's not necessarily abduction. It's not necessarily physical alien hypothesis. Maybe it's ultradimensional, interdimensional, fae, whatever, right? This sense of like, oh, well, I know mainstream culture knows about abduction and stuff like that. I'm not going to deny that can happen, but maybe it's stranger. Maybe it's interdimensional. Maybe it's like, that's what people are implying now. But actually what's happened is people think UFO, and we need someone to say, this is no longer a hypothesis anyone is seriously considering. And the only reason why they're putting it forward is they're afraid of emotional backlash. And I'm willing to work through that emotional backlash, and that's why I'm talking about it. All right, let's keep going. There's an addendum here. So the addendum says, discussion born of this essay has included statements from one of Hopkins' earliest interview subjects, Deb Cobble, Kathy Davis, in Hopkins' book, Intruder. She asserts that the reality of what happened to her, while emphasizing the need not to use terms or definitions that assume we know the nature of the experiences, contesting, for example, the use of the term spaceship. She says, I saw something, I don't know what it was, and sharing her disdain for the term abduction, a term which Dr. Mack tried to de-emphasize in his later work. And I say that's great. I say, let's keep that going. Let's draw the line from John Mack's Abduction to Passport to Cosmos to this later work where he's de-emphasizing abduction, and let's just draw it out and see where we are at and take actions from that point of view instead of honoring John Mack from 2004. Let his legacy continue and grow. Stop defending abduction narratives when there's no evidence. There's really not a lot of support for it except for these sort of political agenda thing that's going on, right? Anyways, you can get to that article on the Johnny Mack Institute website. Please do. So where do we go from here? I don't know. So I'm going to quote from the article they quoted from. The article itself was found in the Wayback Machine, and it is talking about a show that was recorded about reviewing another article. So it's sort of like, I'm not sure what's exactly happening here, but I'm just going to read it so you get the sense of it. This week's show features Deb Kathy Davis Cobble. Deb, Alien Stole My Baby Cobble. the template upon which stories like those of Kim Carlsberg are written. Deb shares with us with all the passion and hurt and anger of someone telling the truth. The truth is, she never said that. That was Bud's theory. The truth is, she doesn't like the term alien abduction because she doesn't know what the phenomena is, but she doesn't think it's extraterrestrial, never saw a spaceship, and has great disdain for the word abduction. The truth is, no matter what she thinks, or Bud Hopkins thinks, or you and I think, none of us know precisely what this stuff is. Is it aliens? Could be, but not the ones we've made in our image. Not the easy ones with a backstory we understand, a propulsion system we understand, and a set of motives we've fleshed out. She doesn't know what happened to her family and her. She doesn't know by whom or by what. She doesn't know the reason. She doesn't know. As the case for I don't know strengthens, the card house of false answers collapses. Deb Cobble is a prequel to Emma Woods. Hopkins' fetus-stealing alien theory flows directly into Jacob's alien-human hybrid plots. And I would say those flow directly into the the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023, which apparently was influenced by Danny Sheehan, who's shopping these stories around in 2024. This was written in 2011, right? It's 13, 12 years later. What's going on? How can this continue? How can very smart, Harvard-educated people put forward these notions with good faith? And how can the community just take it and allow for their testimonies where it should really resolve to, I don't know, this seems dreamlike, but also seems real? How can they allow for their testimonies to be exploited in this way for political action? The answer is simple. They get validation from outside sources, and that is a really great thing, right? They get validation from the mainstream. The mainstream is paying attention to UFOs because Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal wrote an article about UFOs in 2017. They get validation, all of the disclosure movement, abductee testimony people get validation from the fact that maybe Blumenthal might write about them or have written about them. They get validation from the fact that they can go on documentaries and talk about their experiences, and people are seemingly taking it credible. And guess what? Since 2017, UFOs are taken seriously. Therefore, we can really understand that UFO abduction syndrome is a thing. But when you look into the actual data around the UAP footage they've released, or what the actual science that was done with Bigelow, what that was, it is not the abductee narrative. It's not even the nuts and bolts UFO narrative. The videos are sensor anomalies or other things that have prosaic explanation. And the notion that the government is capturing and hiding evidence for UFO visitation in bodies and abductions and stuff like that, that notion is only supported by experience or testimony, right? There's a sort of sleight of hand that goes on. They go, look, UFOs are real. The government says UFOs are real. That means we can pay attention to the abductee testimony. That means aliens are real. But actually, even in early times, right, nobody was really certain that those UFOs produced encounters. They don't know. We look through the documents that establish this as a clinical science or clinical pseudoscience, and we see the level of evidence or the indicators that they're using. It's primarily dreams and anomalies, and that's it. And where do we go from here? I don't know, but it looks to me like we should start at the very beginning, the sense of that dreams can be both real and dreams at the same time, that there's anomalous like sleep paralysis phenomena happening that involves encounters that sometimes involve UFO sightings. Like there's fascinating things here, but I think we need to pause a moment and consider whether or not we want our testimonies to be used as fuel for a political agenda. So here are some reflections. I know I'm not advocating against using the testimonies for a political agenda, by the way. I'm advocating for using them with appropriate epistemologies so that the testimonies may be deeply received by the mainstream. That's what I'm advocating for, because I don't think the mainstream will put up with the BS that calling cognitive dissonance ontological shock, there's too many smart people in the mainstream who know the literature, who have read Paul Tillich's systematic theology to actually put up with this crap. There's too many people who have observed how hypnosis leads to false memories, right? There are too many people who have observed the dreamlike quality of these encounters. So the experiencer community can put their head in the sand and say, abduction testimonies just like other testimonies, abduction testimonies just like poltergeist testimonies, and therefore we need to honor it equally. I say no, it's being used for a political agenda, and if you need any evidence for that, track the work of Blumenthal. He wrote about abductees. He wrote about the UFO whistleblower. Track the work of Danny Sheehan, who apparently influenced the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023 and was Dr. Greer's lawyer or the Council for Disclosure Project and John Mack. So it's really clear and direct. Don't put your head in the sand around that. Just really acknowledge where we are with the literature, and let's put forward an argument that uses appropriate epistemologies grounded in literature to support the experiencer community. And then anyone who's politically minded can use that testimony as fuel for their political agenda. We can become conscious about it. I will advocate for a politically agnostic view. I'm not advocating for or against disclosure. I personally would love to see what could come out of disclosure. I think a lot of stuff would come out, but I don't think it's going to be physical bodies of aliens and UFO abduction syndrome validations and things like that, the thing that we're yearning for. And so I am just inviting a sense of contemplation about the literature here. So I started this video asking the question, is ontological shock a kind of cultish term? And I think it is, actually. I think it is cultish. And that's okay, because we're dealing with groups of people. And back in the day, there used to be cults of Asclepius and cults of Zeus and cults of this and that and the other thing. And those cults sometimes were exploitative and coercive, but a lot of the time they weren't. And I think if we were honest about the nature of our spiritual life, honest about how our dreams really do form a huge part of our lives, and how these non-human intelligences, who often take the form of gods or angels or fairies, if we were honest about those, then we may experience less cognitive dissonance when we relate to ET testimony, right? If we were honest about those, we would be okay with the fact that we are in something like a cult, and that's okay. But if we are not clear or conscious of the fact of where we are, or how we're using testimonies, or how we know that things are real but not dreamlike, if we're not being honest about that, our testimonies are really not being honored as sacred, and they are apparently being used to fuel a political agenda that may or may not pan out. So oftentimes abductees will say, what about the white crow? They say, in order to prove that all crows are not black, you only need to find one white crow, right? And so they say, well, let's really believe in abduction research. That's what they say. Let's believe in these testimonies to find that one white crow, perhaps the smoking gun evidence for UFO abduction syndrome, that sort of thing. Well, if you are capturing crows and tagging them or killing them after you trap them, like, that's problematic way of research, right? Like, there are a lot of crows, and we need to observe that prevalence rate and really talk about it and go, like, is it worthwhile, right? Is the inquiry and how we're doing it worthwhile at this point? And so I'm saying that there is a side effect to holding up abductee testimony as something that is equivalent to other spiritual contact modality testimonies. It is not, because it is part of a political issue, whether or not we like it. And its history is not the same as spiritualist phenomena or psychic visitation things, or it's just not the same. And so we really need to be aware of that. I have sort of pleaded my case a little bit in this experience. I am sort of shocked that the abductee support group community kept me in as long as they did when I started the inquiry. So kudos to them for that, and kudos for them for communicating to me that I was no longer welcome in that community, and kudos to them for bridging communication with me in those ways. So I hope that this video has pleaded my case, perhaps, for maybe not necessarily inviting me back into the abductee support group. I say that's fine. You guys can have your own sort of belief patterns around that. I'm not yearning to be in like demon-possessed support groups, and I don't need to continue to do that. It, for me, was a journey. I needed to figure out, was I an abductee or not? I had believed I was, but I needed to figure that out. And I thank you for the opportunity to really figure that out in a way that I needed to, which involved awkward interpersonal relationships and discoveries of edges and triggers. So thank you for that. So even if you don't accept me back into that community, which I'm not really expecting, I really do hope that you pay attention to my critical literature reviews and my PhD level work in this subject. And please know that I am advocating for the sacredness of abduction testimony. I think I'm the only person doing that in an accredited academic way. I'm the only person doing that I see with a public testimony that's related to abduction. So I say that we can really work together, even if we don't see eye to eye, that we can work together in a way that can really help move our community forward and support transformation of the mainstream into this new worldview, into the new paradigm. So I say that John Mack gave us passport to the cosmos, but he did not fly us there. We actually have to go on that journey for ourselves, each of us. And I believe that as a society, as a community, that we are now firmly holding this passport to the cosmos, but we actually have to journey there here and now, each of us together as a community, that sort of thing. So with that, I hope I have brought some sense of clarity to why I'm doing what I'm doing, as well as the relevance of what I'm doing to abductee testimony. And I hope that this presentation, even if it has been triggering or offensive, may be of benefit to the experiencer abductee community. May you all dream well.